black sand burned under the morning sun. From the cliffs of Mount Suribachi, Japanese soldiers watched the horizon, a gray wall of ships stretching farther than the eye could see. The invasion had begun. They had prepared for this moment for months. Concrete bunkers, artillery hidden in volcanic rock, every approach calculated. The enemy, they believed, would spend days unloading supplies, struggling through the surf before the first trench could even be dug. But within minutes of the first American landing, the beach began to change. Bulldozers rolled out of landing craft like armored beasts, their treads grinding through the sand. Tractors dragged coils of wire and stacks of timber. Engineering teams moved with machine-like rhythm. Shovels flashing, blades carving, sand flying. In less than an hour, the smooth beach had turned into a fortress of trenches, firing pits, and tank revetments. Through their binoculars, Japanese officers stood in disbelief. The Americans weren't just landing. They were building the battlefield as they fought. For the defenders inside Suribachi's tunnels, it was an impossible sight. The enemy had come not only with soldiers and guns, but with machines that could reshape the earth itself. The Pacific's volcanic silence was about to explode. By early 1945, the Pacific War had reached its final and most brutal phase. Japan's empire, once stretching from Burma to the Gilbert Islands, was collapsing piece by piece. Each battle brought the war closer to the home islands, and each one revealed how completely the United States had mastered the science of modern warfare. For Japan's commanders, defense had become a desperate science of attrition. On isolated islands like Saipan, Peleliu, and Leyte, they had turned every ridge, cave, and coral outcrop into fortresses of concrete and stone. The strategy was simple: make every invasion so costly that America would hesitate before landing again. But the Americans never hesitated. What Japanese observers couldn't fully comprehend was that behind every U.S. assault stood an army of engineers, men trained not only to fight, but to build. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and the Navy's construction battalions, the Seabees, were the unseen architects of victory. When the Marines stormed a beach, these men followed within minutes, not hours. They carved runways from coral, built piers where none existed, and dug trenches before the first artillery barrage could find them. To the Japanese, this speed seemed impossible. To the Americans, it was routine. The difference came down to industrial warfare, the one thing Japan could never match. By 1944, the United States was producing more than half of the world's machinery. Factories in Detroit, Pittsburgh, and Seattle worked around the clock, churning out tanks, landing craft, and bulldozers by the thousands. These weren't just civilian machines converted for war. They were redesigned from the ground up for combat zones. In the Pacific, logistics was everything. Every island was an isolated world. No natural harbors, no infrastructure, no roads. Survival depended on how quickly engineers could transform raw, hostile terrain into a functioning base. At the center of this transformation stood the Seabees. They were welders, miners and farmers turned soldiers, men who could fight one moment and pour concrete the next. Their motto said it all: "We build, we fight." When they landed, they brought a new kind of warfare, one measured not by tactics alone, but by time. Every minute gained on the beach was a life saved inland. Every trench dug faster meant one less casualty under Japanese fire. Meanwhile, the Japanese army relied on manpower and discipline. Their fortifications were built by hand, often under extreme conditions. Shovels, picks, and human endurance were their only tools. What took American bulldozers 10 minutes could take a Japanese unit 10 hours. The contrast would soon define the battles that followed. At Saipan in 1944, Japanese officers watched in disbelief as U.S. bulldozers cleared tank paths across the island overnight. On Tinian, the Seabees built a fully operational airfield in just over a week, an achievement that left even American generals stunned. By the time the invasion of Iwo Jima was planned, Japan's defenders had seen enough to know. The Americans didn't just invade, they rebuilt the battlefield faster than anyone could destroy it. That knowledge bred both awe and despair. They knew their courage alone couldn't hold back machines that never tired, never hesitated, never feared, and in the tunnels of Mount Suribachi, as they waited for the next wave to come, Japanese commanders prepared for what they believed would be a long siege, unaware that their enemies' greatest weapon wasn't its bombs or its tanks, it was its engineers. Their speed would redefine what invasion meant. Their machines would reshape the very face of war. The secret behind America's wartime engineering power wasn't only in the machines, it was in the organization. Before the war, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and Navy construction battalions had been small, technical branches, but by 1943, they had become a global industrial force. More than 700,000 engineers, builders, and laborers spread across every ocean and continent. No army in history had ever deployed so many men dedicated to building the battlefield itself. Each invasion plan, from Tarawa to Okinawa, included detailed blueprints for roads, trenches, water systems, and even hospitals. Every assault was followed by an engineering wave armed with graders, bulldozers, and portable cranes. The Japanese, trained under pre-war doctrines that prized endurance and hand-built fortifications, could not imagine the scale of what they saw. Their own engineers worked tirelessly, but lacked both the equipment and the fuel to match American speed. When U.S. forces landed, they brought the mainland with them. Massive LSTs, landing ship, tank, carried not only tanks and supplies, but tractors, shovels, and bulldozers lashed to the decks. Within hours of hitting a beach, these machines were offloaded and roaring to life. Where the Japanese saw chaos, explosions, smoke, bodies, the Americans saw blueprints. As riflemen pushed forward, engineers carved trenches behind them, dug foxholes, and erected sandbag walls in patterns already rehearsed during training. Even under sniper fire, they worked methodically, often shoulder to shoulder with infantry. Every shovelful of dirt had purpose. Every trench was measured. Every road had a destination. At Tarawa, in November 1943, the Japanese garrison believed the coral reefs would protect them from heavy equipment. They were wrong. Seabees lashed bulldozers to amphibious vehicles, drove them straight across the reefs, and began digging defensive positions before the Japanese could reorganize. The entire landscape of the beach transformed in hours. A Japanese officer captured later on Tarawa confessed his shock. They landed with machines as if they carried a city within their ships. The shock was not just technical, it was psychological. The Japanese soldier was taught that endurance, sacrifice, and willpower could overcome any material obstacle. But what they faced was not human endurance. It was mechanical efficiency. American engineers worked in shifts, day and night, under constant shell fire. Their machines didn't tire. When one bulldozer was destroyed, another came ashore. If a road was cratered by artillery, it was rebuilt before dawn. The pace of U.S. construction broke the rhythm of Japanese defense. The defenders expected exhaustion, delay, and disorganization after landings, the chaos that followed most amphibious assaults in history. Instead, the Americans seemed to thrive in it. By 1944, this efficiency reached perfection. The Seabees of the 6th Naval Construction Brigade built the airfields of Tinian that later launched the Enola Gay and Boxcar, the bombers that ended the war. Each project followed the same brutal pattern: land under fire, clear the area, dig trenches, establish water lines, then carve airstrips from the jungle or coral. The work was methodical, unstoppable, and exact. Japanese survivors often spoke of the feeling that the Americans were rebuilding the island beneath their feet. What they didn't realize was that the U.S. military had already turned engineering into an art of war. Every trench, every bunker, every pier was part of a grand system. Logistics turned into strategy. Behind that speed lay an invisible network, supply chains stretching across the Pacific. From Pearl Harbor to Guam, from Australia to the Philippines, ships ferried thousands of tons of machinery, spare parts, and fuel to forward bases. Floating dry docks and mobile workshops allowed engineers to repair vehicles and rebuild equipment even in open seas. It wasn't glamorous, and it didn't make headlines, but it made victory possible. By early 1945, as the Americans prepared to invade Iwo Jima and Okinawa, Japanese intelligence reports noted grimly, "Enemy construction is immediate and continuous. No natural obstacle delays them." To Japan's high command, this was a warning. But for the soldiers waiting in tunnels and caves, it was a mystery. How could a force so far from home move with such precision, such power, such speed? They would soon see it firsthand, as bulldozers rolled onto volcanic ash, carving trenches through a battlefield still, burning with gunfire, and what they saw would shake their belief in what a human army could do. The speed of American trench building wasn't just a display of engineering skill, it was a revelation of how total war had evolved. To understand how it shocked the Japanese, we must see it through multiple lenses: human, tactical, and psychological. Every trench began with a man, or more often a dozen, swinging shovels into alien soil. At Peleliu, the heat reached 115 degrees. At Iwo Jima, volcanic ash clogged every breath. Men dug while shells burst nearby, while machine guns tore through the air, while the ground itself trembled. Combat engineers didn't fight in the same way infantry did, but they faced the same death. Every minute spent exposed with a shovel in hand was a minute in open sight of snipers and mortar crews. Yet they dug anyway. One veteran from the 133rd Seabees later recalled, "We didn't think about fear. We thought about the next trench, the next line of cover. If we stopped, the men behind us died." For Japanese troops, watching this discipline was surreal. They had been trained to see Americans as soft, industrial men who relied on machines, not courage. But on the beaches of Saipan, they watched U.S. engineers crawl forward under fire, pickaxes slamming into coral as shells fell around them. It was not the image of weakness they had been promised. It was a revelation. Americans could work and fight as one. Their machines were not replacing them. They were extensions of their will. The Japanese were masters of static defense, caves, tunnels, and hidden artillery. Their philosophy was to hold ground until the last man. The Americans, by contrast, viewed the battlefield as fluid. Trenches weren't built to hold a position. They were built to expand it. Each trench line marked not the end of movement, but the beginning of the next assault. Engineers worked alongside officers who constantly adjusted positions. Every new trench was part of a living organism. At Okinawa, for example, the U.S. Army's 96th Infantry Division advanced behind a network of freshly dug cover that stretched like veins across the hillside. When the Japanese launched counterattacks, they met soldiers protected by fortifications that hadn't existed just hours before. For the Americans, the shovel became a weapon, a tool that shaped the fight itself. For the Japanese, who were used to long preparation before battle, this was unnerving. They had never faced an army that could build the battlefield as it fought. One Japanese intelligence officer described it simply, "They changed the land itself to defeat us." At the heart of this transformation was technology. and an industrial might that dwarfed anything Imperial Japan could muster. The U.S. had mastered the art of mobile engineering. Compact bulldozers, pneumatic drills, and trenching machines could be shipped, assembled, and deployed within hours. Portable fuel depots, water purification systems, and prefabricated steel bridges turned even the harshest island into a functional base. The Seabees, the U.S. Navy's construction battalions, embodied this innovation. They didn't wait for conditions to improve. They created them. In one iconic moment on Guam, engineers bulldozed through dense jungle to build a trench system that linked the beachhead to an airfield site, before the front lines had even stabilized. The Japanese, watching from hidden positions, were stunned. How could an enemy dig through terrain that had taken them weeks to fortify, and do it in less than a day? The answer lay in mass production. By 1944, the United States was producing over 50,000 bulldozers and 300,000 trucks a year. Every island assault brought dozens with it. Japan, isolated by blockade and resource shortages, could only repair what it already had. Where the Americans brought machines, the Japanese brought shovels. The result was inevitable: speed against endurance, momentum against immobility. War is fought in the mind as much as on the ground, and on the islands of the Pacific, the psychological war was brutal. The Japanese had been taught that the Americans feared hardship, but when they saw soldiers working under shell fire, rebuilding trenches at midnight, and dragging bulldozers through mud and fire, that belief began to fracture. Captured diaries revealed their confusion. They dig like ants. Even when we destroy, they rebuild. It is like the earth fights for them. That was the power of momentum. American troops were trained not to wait, to create progress. Every trench built under fire was a victory of will, proof that the enemy's destruction could not halt their advance. And for Japanese troops entrenched in static positions, that realization was devastating. Their own commanders demanded that they hold ground no matter the cost. But they were facing an army that refused to stay still. Each time the sun rose over a Pacific battlefield, the terrain had changed. New trenches appeared, new roads were cut, new gun positions built. The Japanese soldiers inside their bunkers could feel the island itself shifting against them. To fight an enemy who could reshape the world around you, that was terror. By 1944, it was no longer a question of manpower. It was a question of momentum. And the Americans had made momentum an art form. The Japanese high command began to understand this too late. Their defensive strategies, once thought impenetrable, were being buried beneath the very trenches and roads carved by enemy machines. And soon, that realization would collide with the most intense battle yet. One where the Japanese would witness this terrifying speed in its full, unstoppable force. By mid-1944, the Pacific War had become not just a contest of armies, but a test of ideas. And nowhere was this more visible than in how each side understood the ground itself. To the Japanese, terrain was sacred, something to be defended, held, and died for. To the Americans, terrain was a tool, something to be shaped, cut, and transformed. And at the heart of that difference lay leadership, doctrine, and morality. American engineering dominance wasn't born by accident. It was planned, tested, and perfected. Even before Pearl Harbor, U.S. commanders like General George Marshall and Dwight D. Eisenhower had emphasized mobility and logistics as the essence of modern war. They understood that victory would depend not just on who could destroy the enemy, but on who could move and rebuild faster. In the Pacific, this philosophy found its truest form under General Douglas MacArthur and Admiral Chester Nimitz. Every campaign was designed like a vast engineering equation. Supply routes, fuel depots, trench systems, and airfield construction were treated as weapons equal to bombs and rifles. MacArthur's command in New Guinea was a living demonstration. Each landing was followed immediately by engineer battalions that built trenches, command posts, and airstrips often before the fighting had even ceased. The Japanese commanders, who expected weeks of disorganization, found their foes already entrenched, resupplied, and ready to advance. When questioned by reporters after one such landing, MacArthur gave a simple, cutting answer. "We build our victories." Those 4 words became the unwritten motto of the U.S. engineering effort. Meanwhile, Japanese officers, often trained in pre-war samurai ideals, viewed such pragmatism as dishonorably mechanical. Their military education glorified courage and endurance, not construction or maintenance. To them, a bulldozer could never symbolize bravery. To the Americans, it symbolized survival. By 1943, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers had developed a field manual unlike anything the world had seen. It contained standardized trench dimensions, excavation depths, drainage angles, and even recommended soil types for optimal stability under bombardment. Digging was no longer a desperate reaction. It was a precise, scientific process. Every company had a designated engineer liaison who mapped terrain, assessed soil composition, and assigned labor accordingly. Portable survey instruments allowed soldiers to plan trench networks in the dark, aligning them with firing lines and artillery arcs. Even in the chaos of beach landings, this doctrine held. On Iwo Jima, engineers from the 133rd Naval Construction Battalion dug their first command trench within 20 minutes of landing. It became a forward base for coordination, medical triage, and radio operations. Compare that to the Japanese approach. Hand tools, manual excavation, and rigid command structures that discouraged field adaptation. Their trenches were deep and strong, but static. Once bombed or flanked, they became graves. American trenches, though shallower, were flexible, built to shift, connect, and expand with each phase of battle. This adaptability was the key difference. The Japanese built fortresses. The Americans built systems, and in modern warfare, systems endure where fortresses fall. There was also a moral dimension, one that haunted both sides. For the Americans, digging meant survival. Every trench was a shield against unseen snipers, mortars, and artillery. But for the Japanese watching from their caves, it was something darker, a symbol that their divine defense of the Pacific was being literally buried. Japanese culture placed spiritual weight on the land. To see it reshaped by enemy machines was not only militarily shocking, it was spiritually unsettling. They called the bulldozers iron beasts, and to them, each trench carved into sacred soil was a desecration. For American soldiers, the emotion was different but equally heavy. The trenches they dug were often shallow graves by nightfall. Blood mingled with mud. They built lines of defense they knew might not hold, and every new trench was another reminder that death was close. Yet still they dug, not out of faith or glory, but duty. That quiet, relentless duty became the unspoken rhythm of the Pacific Campaign. While Japanese troops shouted, "Tenno Heika Banzai," "Long live the Emperor," before suicidal charges, American engineers whispered no slogans. Their hands, blistered and bleeding, wrote their statement in the dirt. Every shovel stroke said, "We will live. We will move forward." From the Japanese perspective, the sight of Americans transforming beaches into fortresses in a single day defied understanding. Captured diaries, now preserved in Japanese archives, reveal the bewilderment. They arrive with chaos. Then they organize the earth. Our artillery destroys their lines, but when the sun rises, they have built them again. They have no fear of death, not because they seek it, but because they refuse to stop working. To the Japanese, this wasn't just efficiency. It was madness. How could men continue digging trenches while bombs fell around them? How could they build under constant machine gun fire? What they didn't realize was that American units were built on redundancy and resilience. Leadership rotated seamlessly. If one engineer fell, another took his place. The mission didn't depend on one man. It depended on the system. That was the ultimate shock. Japanese armies fought for spirit and honor. American armies fought for function and survival. One worshipped the ideal of the warrior. The other mastered the machinery of war. And when these two philosophies collided, it was the one with the shovels and bulldozers, not the bayonets, that reshaped the battlefield. By the summer of 1944, the lesson was clear. The Americans were not just fighting on the islands, they were rebuilding them as they went. For Japanese troops entrenched in caves, this realization came with a heavy silence. The enemy could not be stopped, because the enemy never stopped building. And soon, that unstoppable momentum would reach its most terrifying display yet, when trenches, machines, and men would collide in the blood-red sands of Iwo Jima. Iwo Jima, February 19, 1945. The island looked like another planet, a jagged mass of black volcanic ash rising out of a gray sea. To the Japanese soldiers waiting in the tunnels, it was sacred ground, a fortress carved by hand over months of back-breaking labor. To the Americans arriving offshore, it was an objective, a speck of land barely 8 square miles wide, yet crucial for one reason: its airfields. At dawn, the sky trembled with the sound of over 450 ships forming the largest amphibious invasion force in the Pacific War. Battleships pounded the island for days, but the Japanese defenders, hidden deep underground, survived nearly untouched. When the naval guns fell silent, U.S. Marines climbed into their landing craft. They thought the bombardment had cleared the beaches. They were wrong. The first wave of Marines landed at 09:02. The moment their boots hit the shore, the island erupted. Machine guns opened from hidden bunkers. Mortar shells screamed down from Mount Suribachi. Within minutes, the beach was a cauldron of smoke, fire, and death. Men dove for cover, but there was none. The black sand was too soft to hold a trench, too shallow to protect from fire. Every attempt to dig with a shovel ended in collapse. The ground gave way like water. Yet even in that chaos, the engineers moved. Bulldozers were offloaded under fire. Drivers hunched low, guiding their machines through a storm of bullets. Some were hit before they could even lower the blades. Others kept going, engines roaring, steel tearing into volcanic ash. They were building life into death. The first defensive trenches appeared by midday. Shallow, ragged scars that offered just enough protection for medics and riflemen. Behind them, other teams worked to create ramps so tanks and trucks could climb the beach. One Marine lieutenant recalled, "It was like watching men fight the island itself. The ground was our enemy as much as the Japanese." By the end of the first day, 2,400 Americans lay dead or wounded, but the line held. Trenches, foxholes, and supply routes were forming, faint but real. The Japanese defenders had expected confusion, perhaps even retreat. Instead, they saw something incomprehensible. Under shell fire, Americans were building. The following morning, the process intensified. Seabees brought in larger bulldozers and began carving out proper trench systems, drainage ditches, command trenches, and machine gun nests. Each one was marked with colored flags for coordination. Infantry moved in sync with the engineers, using the trenches to advance yard by yard. Japanese artillery targeted the construction zones relentlessly, but every crater created by an explosion was repurposed within minutes. Engineers turned bomb holes into foxholes, shell craters into firing pits. A Japanese officer later wrote, "Their dead become their defense. They used destruction as material." That was the essence of American battlefield engineering, turning chaos into structure. By the third day, the transformation was undeniable. What had been open beach was now a connected web of trenches and roads stretching toward the base of Mount Suribachi. The Japanese could scarcely believe it. Inside their tunnels, officers listened to the grinding of engines, the clanking of steel, the constant noise of construction. They had assumed the volcanic soil would make mechanized work impossible, but the bulldozers, fitted with wide tracks, adapted to it. When one sank, another pulled it free. When one broke, its parts were cannibalized to fix others. The Americans weren't just fighting, they were adapting in real time. Each day, the U.S. lines crept closer to the mountain. Every trench dug under fire shortened the killing ground. Machine guns now operated from newly dug positions. Mortar crews found stability in reinforced pits. Supplies moved faster through trenches than across open ground. What began as survival had become momentum. The Japanese defense plan, built on the belief that the beach would consume the invaders, was unraveling. Their observers reported with disbelief that the enemy's trenches were appearing faster than they could be destroyed. They had spent months digging tunnels. The Americans were matching their work in days. The difference was crushing. For every Japanese soldier who dug a trench by hand, the Americans had a dozen engineers and 2 bulldozers. When the 5th Marine Division finally reached the slopes of Mount Suribachi on February 22nd, their approach was protected by hundreds of yards of freshly dug trenches linking the shore to the mountain base. From above, Japanese observers saw it. The landscape itself was changing color. The black volcanic dust was carved into clean lines, sharp angles, geometric networks. It no longer looked like a natural island. It looked like a fortress, but one built by the invaders. In Tokyo, the Imperial General Staff received the first detailed reports of Iwo Jima's transformation. They could scarcely believe the pace of the enemy's construction. Their analysis concluded grimly. Enemy engineering activity exceeds expectation. Beaches fortified in less than 48 hours. Countermeasures ineffective. To the Japanese High Command, that line meant failure. To the men trapped on the island, it meant terror. They began to understand that this was not the slow, predictable war of attrition they had trained for. This was something else. An enemy that could reshape the world around them faster than they could react. The realization spread through their tunnels like a whisper. If they can build this fast, they will never stop. But the true test was yet to come. The Japanese defenders of Mount Suribachi had sworn to fight to the last man. And as the Americans dug closer, their trenches would meet the tunnels, 2 worlds colliding beneath the same ground. That was where the terror would become personal. By February 23, 1945, Iwo Jima had become a graveyard, but also a construction site. The air was thick with ash and the stench of death. Marines crawled through a landscape that looked alive, the ground constantly shifting from bombardment and bulldozer tracks. The Japanese had turned Mount Suribachi into a fortress of tunnels and chambers. More than 11 miles of underground passages, command rooms and firing points. From within, they could hear the engines of bulldozers, the grind of trenching blades, the rhythmic chop of shovels. They realized with dread that the enemy wasn't just surviving the bombardment, he was reshaping the island above them. For days, the 2 forces lived and fought only meters apart, one above, one below. Every trench dug by Americans risked breaking into a hidden tunnel. Every Japanese counterattack risked emerging into a fresh American trench line. It was warfare collapsing in on itself. The Americans advanced not through open charges, but through construction. Each yard gained meant another trench, another segment of road, another supply route. As the front lines moved, bulldozers followed immediately behind, turning chaos into structure. At one point, a Marine engineer crew worked for 6 straight hours under sniper fire to complete a communication trench linking two companies. The moment it was finished, wounded men were carried through it to safety, the difference between life and death measured in feet of dirt. That was the kind of war Iwo Jima became, where the shovel was as crucial as the rifle. By dawn on the fifth day, the American front had reached the base of Mount Suribachi. The black slope loomed over them like a living thing. Every ridge was booby-trapped. Every tunnel was manned. Yet the Marines didn't stop digging. Bulldozers carved step-like trenches into the mountain's base to serve as platforms for artillery. Mortar pits were reinforced with sandbags, while engineers laid cable lines through the trenches for radio communication. To the Japanese defenders above, it looked impossible. The enemy was climbing through engineering. Their commander, Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, had designed Iwo Jima's defense to bleed the Americans dry. He ordered no suicidal charges. Instead, he planned a battle of attrition fought from beneath the ground. But what he hadn't foreseen was that the Americans would turn the island itself into a weapon. Each bomb crater was repurposed into a trench segment. Each destroyed bunker became a foundation for another. When Kuribayashi's men tried to resurface to fire, they found themselves staring down gun barrels already positioned in freshly dug trenches. One captured Japanese soldier told interrogators, "We could hear them digging, always digging. When we looked up, they were already there." By the sixth day, Marines had surrounded the base of Mount Suribachi from three sides. The trenches connecting them formed a full encirclement. A man-made ring that cut off all escape routes for the Japanese inside the mountain. That's when the order came for one final stand. Kuribayashi's officers, trapped and cornered, launched counterattacks from tunnel exits, charging straight into the American trenches. The fighting was hand-to-hand, close enough to feel the breath of the enemy. Grenades rolled down trench lines. Bayonets flashed in the dark. Bulldozers, unable to distinguish friend from foe, kept working even during the chaos, sealing tunnel entrances with soil as Japanese soldiers tried to break through. To the Japanese, this was horror. They had never faced an army that fought and built at the same time. By afternoon, the Marines broke through to the upper slopes. Combat engineers, still digging communication trenches behind the advancing lines, suddenly stopped as word spread. A group of Marines had reached the summit. At 10:20 a.m. on February 23rd, a small American flag was raised atop Mount Suribachi. It was a modest gesture, seen by only a few, but when a larger flag replaced it hours later, photographer Joe Rosenthal captured the moment that would define the Pacific War. For the men below, still in the trenches, that sight wasn't about glory. It was about relief. The flag meant the impossible had been achieved. Not by charge, but by inches of dirt, hours of labor, and the relentless rhythm of shovels. The Japanese soldiers still alive beneath the mountain could see the flag through cracks in the rock. For them, it was not just defeat, it was disillusionment. Their months of preparation, the sacred soil they had sworn to defend, had been conquered not by superior numbers, but by the enemy's will to build faster than they could destroy. A Japanese survivor later wrote, "The island itself betrayed us. We fought for it, but they remade it." That line would echo through the remnants of the Imperial Army. The realization that modern war was no longer about bravery alone. The time the fighting on Iwo Jima ended on March 26, 1945, over 21,000 Japanese soldiers had died. Only 216 were captured alive. But as the survivors were led through the American trench systems, wide, structured, perfectly aligned, they saw the terrifying truth. The invaders had turned their fortress into a machine. The very tunnels that once gave Japan power were now buried beneath networks of American trenches, fuel depots, and airstrips already under construction. And when the U.S. flag waved over the rebuilt summit of Mount Suribachi, it wasn't just a symbol of victory. It was proof that the Americans had mastered something even deadlier than firepower: the ability to reshape the Earth itself in war. The Japanese High Command received reports from Iwo Jima with disbelief. The documents described beaches fortified in hours, roads built under fire, and mountain slopes dug into steps. One general is said to have whispered, "They fight with time itself." Because by then, it was no longer a war for land. It was a war for speed. And Japan had lost that war completely. When the guns fell silent on Iwo Jima, the island no longer resembled the volcanic rock the Japanese had fortified for over a year. It had been torn open, reshaped, and rebuilt, mile by mile, by American hands. In just 36 days of fighting, U.S. Marines and Navy Seabees had transformed a barren wasteland into one of the most strategically vital positions in the Pacific. Trenches that once sheltered men became communication lines. Roads carved by bulldozers led straight to the new airstrips already taking form. Within hours of the final Japanese resistance collapsing, engineers began flattening ground for aircraft operations. On March 4, 1945, while fighting was still raging in the north, the first American B-29 Superfortress made an emergency landing on the half-finished airstrip. The crew survived. That single event justified everything. The losses, the exhaustion, the unimaginable sacrifice. By war's end, over 2,400 B-29 bombers would make similar emergency landings on Iwo Jima. Each of those aircraft carried 10 or 11 men. Tens of thousands of lives saved because the Marines and engineers had dug faster, built sooner, and refused to stop. But beneath that achievement lay an ocean of loss. Nearly 7,000 Marines were dead, and over 20,000 wounded. The island was so small that the graves almost touched one another. Even the Japanese prisoners who survived were astonished, not just by the American firepower, but by their endurance. In an interrogation report filed weeks later, one Japanese officer said quietly, "They fight like machines, but they build like gods." That phrase, meant as disbelief, spread among American units as a quiet point of pride. It symbolized what the Pacific War had become, a contest not just of weapons, but of willpower translated into engineering. The U.S. High Command understood this completely. General Holland M. Smith, the Marine commander for Iwo Jima, later remarked, "The bulldozer won this war as surely as the rifle did." He wasn't exaggerating. Every assault across the Pacific, from Tarawa to Saipan, from Iwo Jima to Okinawa, had revealed the same truth. Survival belonged to those who could dig, build, and adapt the fastest. But for Japan, the psychological shock ran deeper than strategy. When news of Iwo Jima's fall reached Tokyo, it was met with stunned silence. The island had been declared impregnable. Kuribayashi's underground fortress was supposed to hold for months. Yet it had been reduced in just over a month. Not by raw destruction, but by an enemy who rebuilt while they fought. For the Imperial Army, that realization was devastating. The myth of moral superiority, that spiritual strength could overcome material power, had shattered. Kuribayashi's letters, recovered from the ruins, reflected a commander who already knew this truth before he died. In one of his last messages, he wrote, "Our courage is strong, but their resources are endless. They create the ground beneath their feet." It was not just a metaphor. He had literally watched the Americans create new terrain out of ash and rubble, inch by inch, as his own men disappeared into the soil. That transformation changed how both sides viewed war itself. For the Americans, Iwo Jima became proof that technology and manpower, when fused with discipline, could overcome any defense. For the Japanese, it was proof that courage alone was no longer enough. The battle reshaped military doctrine. Trench warfare, long considered outdated after World War I, returned, redefined. Now it was mobile, driven by machines and engineering units that could construct entire networks under fire. Every American trench dug on Iwo Jima became a case study in battlefield engineering. Within months, new manuals were printed, detailing techniques pioneered by the Seabees and Marine engineers. Those same principles would soon be used on Okinawa, the final and bloodiest battle before Japan's surrender. But even as engineers built airstrips and bunkers on Iwo Jima, they often found the remains of the enemy beneath their work. Tunnels collapsed into their trenches. The earth revealed the cost of victory. One Marine sergeant wrote in his diary, "We built our runways on the bones of the enemy. Every time the wind blows, it smells like history." Second, Haunting Line captured the essence of Iwo Jima. Victory earned through creation and destruction at the same time. And as the airstrips came alive with roaring bombers bound for Tokyo, the men who built them rarely looked up. They were already digging the next trench, leveling the next road. Because in their minds, the war was far from over. The island had been conquered, but its meaning had only begun to unfold. When Iwo Jima fell, Japan lost more than an island. It lost a symbol, the belief that courage alone could stop an empire built on machines. In Tokyo, the Imperial General Staff analyzed the reports from surviving officers and concluded that the Americans had achieved something beyond military calculation. The speed with which they had transformed the battlefield, digging trenches, laying cables, building airfields, revealed a new kind of warfare, one in which engineering was strategy. Japanese analysts noted that the Americans could establish defensive and offensive positions simultaneously. While Japanese troops fought from pre-built tunnels and caves, the Americans created their own cover from the open ground, adapting every inch of terrain to their advantage. It was as if they carried their own fortress ashore. The lessons were grim. For Japan's high command, the implications were clear. No amount of fortification could withstand a force that could build its own battlefield faster than it could be destroyed. This realization shaped the final months of the war. As the Allies turned toward Okinawa, Japan's engineers scrambled to replicate the defensive tunnel networks of Iwo Jima. Deeper, more complex, more desperate. But by then, American efficiency had reached industrial perfection. Bulldozers, cranes, and portable construction units followed the troops wherever they went. Every beach became a base. Every crater became a trench. The battlefield had become a moving city, fueled by logistics, powered by machines, commanded by engineers. This fusion of manpower and machinery defined the American war effort in 1945. At its heart were the U.S. Navy's Seabees, the combat engineers whose motto, "We build, we fight," became the silent creed of victory. They operated under fire, constructing roads, trenches, and landing strips, while shells fell around them. At Iwo Jima, they worked side by side with Marines, often fighting hand-to-hand before picking up shovels again. Their speed astonished even their own commanders. After the battle, Admiral Nimitz praised them directly, saying, "Among the Americans who served on Iwo Island, uncommon valor was a common virtue. But the men who built under fire gave us the ground we needed to win." It wasn't poetry. It was reality. The Seabees had reshaped warfare, proving that victory belonged not only to the soldier who advanced, but to the builder who made that advance possible. And their impact extended far beyond the Pacific. The innovations in rapid trenching, prefabricated fortifications, and mobile construction would influence military engineering for decades. When the Korean War began 5 years later, U.S. forces built defensive lines in a fraction of the time it once took. In Vietnam, combat engineering became the backbone of every base. The lessons of Iwo Jima had become standard doctrine. But for Japan, Iwo Jima was an ending, the last barrier before the homeland itself. The island's airfields became staging grounds for bombing raids over Tokyo, Nagoya, and Osaka. From these runways, B-29 superfortresses carried the war directly to Japan's heart. Each takeoff from Iwo Jima symbolized the industrial momentum that Japan could no longer match. The sky that once carried Japan's Zero fighters now carried fleets of bombers, flying from a base carved out of Japanese soil by American machines. The transformation was psychological as much as military. In the weeks following Iwo Jima's fall, Japanese propaganda fell silent about spiritual strength. Instead, newspapers spoke of total material war. The empire's leaders knew that no amount of courage could overcome the steel tide that now approached their shores. Kuribayashi's defeat became a prophecy. His prediction that the enemy creates the ground beneath their feet echoed through Japan's collapsing defenses. Even as Tokyo prepared for the final invasion, they understood that the Americans would arrive with not just weapons, but the power to build, faster, stronger, and endlessly. In that realization lay the true terror for Japan's commanders. Napalm could burn fields, bombs could shatter cities, but the ability to rebuild the battlefield, to turn destruction into progress, was something no empire could stop. By August 1945, as mushroom clouds rose over Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the memory of Iwo Jima lingered in every Japanese military mind. It had been the first clear sign that Japan was fighting not just an army, but an engine of civilization. When the surrender came, the lessons of Iwo Jima remained carved into the black sand. Trenches filled, airstrips humming, a monument to human ingenuity in the face of unthinkable loss. It was not just a battlefield. It was the blueprint of modern war. The black sands of Iwo Jima are quiet now. The roar of bulldozers and the crash of artillery have long faded into the Pacific wind. What remains are the faint scars, trenches swallowed by time, runways cracked by the sea, and the rusting bones of machines that once shaped history. Iwo Jima was more than a battle. It was a turning point in how humanity waged war. It proved that victory no longer belonged solely to those who fought hardest, but to those who could build fastest. For centuries, soldiers dug trenches by hand, a symbol of endurance, of men against earth. But on that volcanic island, something changed. Machines replaced muscles. Engineering replaced improvisation. The battlefield itself became a living organism, constantly rebuilt under fire. And within that transformation lay both progress and tragedy. The same ingenuity that saved lives also made destruction more efficient. The same machines that carved safety from the sand also paved runways for bombers bound for Tokyo. Humanity had learned not only how to fight, but how to manufacture war. For the Japanese defenders, Iwo Jima marked the death of an era, the moment courage bowed before capability. For the Americans, it was proof that the fusion of mind, machine, and manpower could overcome even the fiercest defense. But for history, it stands as a warning. Because on Iwo Jima, the world glimpsed what happens when war becomes industrial, when men turn their intelligence not just to survival, but to efficiency. It is a reminder that human progress, without restraint, can build as easily as it destroys. Today, the winds still blow over that tiny island, carrying whispers of the men who fought, built, and fell there. Beneath its hardened soil lie both the tools of victory and the cost of ambition. And perhaps that is Iwo Jima's final lesson. That in the end, the greatest power is not in how quickly we can dig trenches or raise machines, but in whether we can learn when to stop building war itself.